Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will try and tell you a bit about what kind of work we're doing. I'm a professor at Aalborg University. I specialize in energy systems analysis, technical aspects and economic aspects of these large-scale integration of renewables and energy storages. I hope today I can give you some kind of insights into some of our works. It's very hard to condense all of the information down into something understandable in a short term, but I will try and do my best. Also, I would hope that you will leave with the impression that there's a lot of technical issues that already are solved, that the economics in large-scale integration of renewables is actually good, and that technologies are not only applicable in Denmark, physics do apply outside Denmark as well. Technologies are not significantly different outside Denmark. So we know that we have been introduced to a lot of challenges regarding CO2 emissions. We know that we have a lot of challenges with regards to the security of supply in our energy systems. We also have a lot of challenges regarding keeping low costs in the energy systems. If we want to go for renewable energy, it is clear that we need to look at how we design the system. Now, the current system is extremely flexible. Whenever we turn on our appliances, we have a generator that's able to immediately turn up or down. So we have a storage of our energy in the fuels that we put into our system. Now, we can, in principle, replace a lot of this with biomass, but as all of you probably know, replacing all fossils or nuclear with biomass is really not feasible. And this means that we have a very big challenge, because we need to use intermittent resources to a very large extent in the future. If we look at bioenergy, I just put up these figures. We have in the world, we have some world assessments of how much biomass is available, and it seems to be between 10 gigawatt hours, or 10 gigajoules, sorry, and 50 gigajoule per capita per year. That's really not a lot. And also the biomass is unevenly distributed around the world, so we can't assume that even though there's a lot of biomass, or there's this amount of biomass available, that it will be everywhere. And using this interval, I've just sort of put up some figures about how much biomass is available. For Denmark, it's really low amounts, up to 0.3 ettajoules. In the EU, it's up to 25 ettajoules. In Japan, it's up to 6.1 etajoule, and in Germany, maybe up to 4.3. Now, I know in Germany, that's probably very high, so you can't apply the global average for Germany, so it's going to be lower than that in reality. And for Japan, I am absolutely certain that the high level is much higher than the actual available biomass resource in Japan. And this means that we really have a big challenge. We really need to use intermittent resources and focus on using the lowest amount of biomass possible. If we do that, we need to change the system. Now, here's a small diagram about the current energy system. I won't go through it. I'll just mention that we need to fundamentally change the way we think about the energy system. We need to think about how we integrate storages in another part of the energy sector than the fuels that we are currently putting in to the fossil fuel energy systems. So in a new system, we need to think about integration. Now, what a lot of the talks has been about is the electricity sector. If we focus on the electricity sector, we will not be able to redesign the system. We need to focus on the heating sector, we need to focus on the transport sector, and by doing so, we are actually able to cost effectively come a much further way. we have a lot of sort of state-of-the-art knowledge about how we can go to 100% renewable in the Danish context. So I will go through some of the results that we have done. Of course, there are quite a lot of barriers, not the least public regulation barriers and how to design markets and subsidies. But there are also a lot of technologies that are already ready. If we sort of condense down into very, very short what kind of strategies we need to do to have a redesign of the system, we can sort of divide them into 3 segments. First of all, as you all know, we need to do energy savings. Now, 1 kilowatt hour in the electricity sector that we're not using is extremely feasible and extremely low cost. So we need to redesign the appliances, and we need to focus on energy savings in the electricity sector. If we move on to the industrial sector, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits that can be implemented. But more complicated, maybe buildings. Now, buildings, at least in the European Union, are using about half of the energy that we are using in EU, and there's a lot of lack of focus on this sector, in my opinion. And one of the things that we have tried to focus on is what are the balances between refurbishment of houses, insulating houses, and the production side. So you need to have a balance between how do we supply heat and how do we refurbish our buildings. So I'll come back to a study on that on the European level. The next thing we need to do is to have efficiency improvement. So we need to install more efficient power plants. They need to be flexible. We need to install heat pumps. We need to install district heating systems, district cooling systems. So that means high investment costs, but also very, very low-hanging fruits in regard to access to low-value heat. The next thing is we need to have a very large-scale implementation of renewable energy sources. And when we do that, of course, we come into a number of challenges. Because not only have we increased the fluctuating renewables, we have also decreased the demand, which means that the integration challenge is actually going to be even harder in the future. But having said that, there's also something that becomes a lot easier if you start to redesign the system. Because some of the conversion, some of the improvements in the energy efficiency improvements, when we introduce electric vehicles, when we introduce heat pumps, will actually give us a larger electricity demand. Even though it's overall more efficient, we will have a lot more flexible demands in the electricity sector than we do today. Now, I'll just have a little example of some of the things that has been done in the Danish system. And here you see a map of Denmark in '85 and a map of Denmark in 2009, and it's more or less the same today. What you see as small red little dots here, they're central power plants, predominantly based on coal in '85. A lot of them are CHP, combined heat and power. But all of them almost are based on coal, a few on natural gas. And what this represents is what we call a classical, traditional energy system design, where you have some large central production units supplying electricity, and the heat production in the individual houses are predominantly single boiler systems. When we move to this side of the slide, we see 2009. And in 2009, we have a lot more things going on. All of the yellow little dots around are combined heat and power plants in cities down to 200 inhabitants. Most of them are between 10,000 and 100,000 inhabitants. And also what we see is a very large amount of wind turbines dispersed. You can't see it from the distance, but they're also on the picture. But what does this mean? Well, this means that in this system here, we had a lot of power plants producing a lot of power, but wasting a lot of heat. in this system here, we have a lot of power plants dispersed around the country, producing a lot of heat, and also using the heat locally. This is one of the fundamental changes in the system design that needs to take place if we want a cost-effective, cost-optimal system, because if we don't redistribute how power plants are built, combined heat and power is not able to take place, and we will simply waste heat up in the air, which will then have to be supplied by boilers. Now, some of the results currently are that we have more than 42% of wind power in the Danish grid. Actually, if you go to the western Danish part here, which is a TSO system on its own, we have more than 55% of wind power managed in that system. In Denmark, we have more than 100,000 wind turbine owners out of a population of 5.5 million. We have a very, very high share of offshore wind power, around 1,300 megawatts offshore installed. 30% of the electricity production is distributed, and 50% is from combined heat and power. Around 60% of the heating supply is district heating. And what you don't see on the picture is heat savings. One of the first things that were done were heat savings, and that's of course extremely important. I think many of the situations that Denmark has been in is similar to Japan in respects to some of the challenges that has triggered the transition. Now our transition was triggered in the 70s when we had the oil crisis, and Danish prime ministers were traveling down to the Middle East to make agreements about oil prices for Denmark, and we had Sundays where we couldn't drive in cars. So government quickly realized we have to do something about this. We were 100% depending on oil, and the prices were fluctuating up and down. And what you see here is then the 40 years that has passed since 1970 until 2012 here today. And the key thing, three key things that has happened. We've insulated our houses, we have put up combined heat and power, and we put up wind turbines. And by doing so, we have actually had a constant energy supply, or primary energy supply, with a growth of more than 100% of GDP at the same time. We did not start by doing this because of climate change. We did it because we had a deficit on the balance of payment, because we had a large unemployment, and because businesses could not survive in a situation where oil prices were fluctuating up and down months end and months on. So we have now a very low cost system, an efficient system, we have a high security of supply, and we have low CO2 emissions. We can also see that if we want to go forward, we have a number of problems. Now, I forgot to mention on the last slide that the long-term official goal of Denmark is to be 100% renewable, including transport, in 2050. And that's 35 years from now. This is the current energy system. We see that we went from 100% dependency on oil to a very diverse system where this represents renewables, so around 25%. Then we have oil down here, and we have natural gas, and we have coal. What we see in the future is we need to move over into wind and biomass. This is the amount of biomass available, and that's probably too high compared to the world resources. This is the amount of wind available in the Danish system. So this is why we need to have a fundamental redesign of our system to be able to achieve this. Just very briefly, regarding balance of payment, we started in the 70s having a very, very large deficit on the balance of payment. This is the balance of payment here, and this is the cost of importing oil. And then we started to find oil in the North Sea, but we also started to use energy more efficiently. And we can see, if you compare the balance of payment to the energy related import or export, then it has a very high effect. This is the oil export, and that is now decreasing. But this up here is actually a technology export. So having developed technology, you're also able to develop. And I think I'm very happy if things are being pushed forward. You need to have targets to be able to have this technology development, because that will drive down prices very significantly. Now, we thought at a certain point of time that we wanted to investigate what would happen if we started to apply some of these principles on a European scale. And this is where we did something we called Heat Roadmap Europe. Now, we saw that heating and cooling in Europe has been largely overlooked in most scenarios looking forward to 2050. Or if you look at them, the only thing you do is to electrify the houses, the heat supply, and do a lot of energy savings without assessing costs or assessing whether there could be other things to do. So more than 70% of Europeans live in cities. So we did a large study where we mapped all of Europe, the building types in Europe, the cost of refurbishment were assessed, the renewable energy sources were assessed, and we did energy system analysis of this together with a number of other key partners in Europe. And what we found was that we were able to go to as a low assessment in 2050 to 50% district heating, where then the rural parts were supplied by heat pumps, and we were able to identify that 35% heat savings would be a cost optimal point between the supply and the demand side. Now, I get really annoyed sometimes when you see numbers about CO2 abatement costs, because what I want to see is what kind of technologies and alternatives are behind. And what annoys me is that known technology, as we have assessed here, can actually have CO2 abatement benefits. There can be benefits of doing so, because when we have redesigned the system, we are able to meet the same targets, but with 100 billion euros of cost less than other alternatives. We did a very large study on it, and the results were that just having very simply implemented this, we were able to have 77% lower fuel consumption overall, not even introducing a lot of energy savings. This is not the 35% energy savings level, this is just introducing district heating. We were able to have 13% lower fossil fuels, 17% lower CO2 emissions, have room for more renewables, and also show that there are more jobs in this kind of system. In the future, we need to move on from the heat sector, which means that we need to look at the energy storage options we have available. We have done quite a number of studies about what technologies are able to integrate renewables. We have looked at vehicle-to-grid, flexible consumption, electricity storage, stopping wind turbines, electric vehicles, heat pumps, a number of them. What we see, I won't go through all of them, but what we see is that using electricity storage is something we should not do. Using thermal storages, using gas storages is something that is much more efficient and where we can create a lot more flexibility in the future. If we look at storages, I have included here a small diagram. This is a logarithmical scale. The price is on this axis, the efficiency is on this axis, and what we see is if we use electricity storage, we have extremely high costs compared to thermal, a factor of 10 higher costs, and compared to gas, a factor of 100, and then even lower for, actually 10,000, sorry, and for liquid fuels even lower. And what we see also on the efficiency side is that when you have a turnaround efficiency of electricity of 70%, they're nearly 100 for the other kind of storages. Now this tells us that we need to focus on other kind of storages than electricity. We need electric vehicles, yes, but we don't need to store electricity in batteries to put it on the grid again. What we find is that we need to have a much more integrated approach, and we call it a smart energy system. The smart grid often leads to focus on transmission lines and electricity storage. What we need is to look at heating and gas and transportation, which represents much cheaper options for integration. So we need to have power to heat, power to gas, power to transport as options for the future that are much more cost effective. I think I'll just skip that. The transport sector is a really big problem now. I include this slide just to show you how many complicated biofuel ideas that are out there. I believe we need to have a lot of electric vehicles in the personal transport, but we do have a number of challenges. We have the trucks, we have the ships, we have the aviation, and if we use second generation biofuels to supply those transport demands, there will not be a drop of biomass left for anything else, not least mentioning food production, medical appliances, other kind of issues that needs to be covered in the future. Now we investigated this to great detail about how much biomass needs to be used and what kind of options we have. And one of the things that we found very usable was this option. We produce here a methanol or methane, and now out here we have 100 petajoules of methanol, and over here we have the input, and the input here is 75 petajoules of biomass, and down here we have electricity inputs to produce hydrogen, which is then combined with the carbon source from gasified biomass into methanol. This is a very short introduction to this, but what you need to notice is we have a larger output of fuel on this side than the input of biomass on this side. This is a totally other kind of system than if you use biomass, biofuels, bioethanol or this kind of thing. The key thing here is you can actually replace the biomass. So if you have carbon capture and storage, you can replace the biomass, use the hydrogen down here to produce this methanol. And you can even use this as a carbon sink. So instead of having CCS on a biomass power plant, you can use this to store carbon if you need to have negative carbon emissions. I have not assessed that. That is something I mentioned because it was discussed earlier. We did a recent study where we looked at the context Denmark is in. Now, we are heavily connected to foreign countries with electricity, but also with fuel supplies. I just like to introduce this small graph showing the world oil prices. Now, this stops at $100 per barrel. I think most of you probably know it's lower now. I think it's probably 60, some 50 or 70, between 50 or 70 or something like this. But what we see here is a graph showing oil prices in 2015 in 2015 equivalent costs. And what we see is very large fluctuations over time. So what we need to think of in the future is that biomass can have the same kind of kind of fluctuations, but also in the transition towards more renewables, we need to survive in a world with fluctuating prices. A lot of people try to do oil price projections, so I included them here. This is mostly based on the IEA, even though it's from the Danish Energy Authority. And I included it even though I know it's extremely confusing, because that is what it is. And this represents the $100 per barrel that we have today. This represents projections from 10 years ago, this area. This represents the projections of today, $140, $50, $60 per barrel. This is what most people base their analysis on. They take one of these and then they base their analysis on that. That is highly problematic, really highly problematic. We need to be able to survive in all of these futures. We need to have a robust system that can survive in all of these futures. What we have just completed now is a study where we try to do that, and the organizers of this symposium have been a bit annoyed with me because I haven't answered emails. But the reason was that on Tuesday we presented this new study. It's called the EDA Energy Vision, and it's an update with state-of-the-art knowledge about how to design renewable energy systems in 2035 and 2050 for Denmark. What we see is that 100% renewable is technically possible and feasible. We can design systems that are robust against different levels of biomass prices, reflecting the scarcity of biomass. We can design system that meets the level that we're allowed, so to say, to use in Denmark, not saying whether we should use Danish biomass resources, Canadian or Estonian, but just saying we can meet that level. And what we have also shown is that it provides more jobs and creates much lower health costs than current systems. The lower biomass you have, the higher combustion you have in your system. So the higher biomass you have, the higher combustion you have in your system. The higher fossil you have, the higher combustion you have. And if you have a lot of intermittent renewables, you will have lower emissions and lower health costs. So I believe we here have designed a system where we decide ourselves when to trade between Denmark and other countries, and are not depending on import or export, but can trade whenever the opportunity is there, because we have introduced a lot of flexible options in the heating and transport system as well. And there are just a few links. We have smartenergysystems.eu. This is our energy modeling tool, Energy Plane. We have around 1,800 users worldwide, about 100 in Germany, and 100 in Britain, and also some in Japan. There's a map, you can go and contact them. The name's actually on the website. And the Heat Roadmap Europe study is heatroadmap.eu. So thank you for your attention.